In a cozy farmhouse on the outskirts of Grand Rapids, Michigan, a widow in her 70s was about to discover the devastating truth about her relationship with her only son. What began as a traditional Christmas gathering erupted into heartbreak. When Evelyn Monroe overheard her son Richard call her "dead weight" to his wife, never suspecting that this cruel comment would lead her to make the most empowering decision of her later years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the dining room chimed 6 times, filling the warm air with its familiar melody. Evelyn Monroe adjusted her favorite green cardigan and peered through the kitchen window at the snow gently falling on her 5-acre property. The farmhouse had been her home for over 40 years. A sanctuary she'd built with her late husband Thomas before his passing 7 years ago. Just a dash more nutmeg, she murmured to herself, sprinkling the spice into the eggnog mixture. Christmas Eve dinner had always been her specialty, a tradition she maintained with unwavering dedication despite the changes life had brought. At 73, Evelyn's hands showed the roadmap of her life, slightly gnarled from arthritis but still capable of creating the holiday feast her family anticipated each year. The sound of tires crunching on the snow-covered driveway pulled her attention from the stovetop. Her son Richard and his family had arrived. Evelyn felt the familiar flutter of excitement and apprehension that had become her companion during family gatherings over the past few years. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the entryway, her steps deliberate but eager. "Grandma." 10-year-old Emma burst through the door first, her cheeks flushed from the cold, dark braids bouncing as she hurried to embrace Evelyn. "There's my sweet girl," Evelyn said, wrapping her arms around her granddaughter. Emma smelled of winter air and the strawberry shampoo she'd favored since she was small. "How's my favorite 5th grader?" "I got the lead in the school play," Emma announced, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'm going to be Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz." "Well, that calls for celebration," Evelyn smiled, her heart warming at her granddaughter's enthusiasm. "I still have that old sewing machine in the spare room. Perhaps we could work on your costume together." Richard entered next, carrying several wrapped packages. At 45, he bore a striking resemblance to his late father, the same broad shoulders and sandy hair, though Richard's was already showing significant gray at the temples. Behind him came Melissa, his wife of 15 years, clutching their designer handbag and wearing an expression that Evelyn had long ago stopped trying to interpret. "Merry Christmas, Mom," Richard said, leaning down to place a perfunctory kiss on her cheek. Evelyn noticed he didn't quite meet her eyes, a habit that had developed over the past year. "The house smells wonderful, Evelyn," Melissa offered, handing over a bottle of wine. "We brought a Cabernet. I hope that pairs well with dinner." "Any wine is welcome at my table," Evelyn replied warmly, taking the bottle. Come in, come in. Dinner's almost ready, just finishing the rolls." As they settled into the familiar rhythm of the holiday gathering, Evelyn couldn't help but notice the slight tension in Richard's shoulders, the way his eyes darted around the farmhouse as if taking inventory. She'd seen this behavior increasing over the past few visits, a calculating assessment that made her feel like her home was being appraised rather than enjoyed. 13-year-old Noah, Richard and Melissa's oldest, remained glued to his phone in the living room, responding to his grandmother's greeting with a distracted nod. Times had changed from when Richard was a boy, running through these same rooms with boundless energy, hanging on every word of his father's stories. The contrast between then and now sometimes left Evelyn with an ache she couldn't quite name. Dinner progressed with the usual exchange of school updates and work anecdotes. Richard's position as a financial advisor at a prestigious firm in Grand Rapids provided him with plenty of stories about clients and market trends. Evelyn listened attentively, nodding and asking questions in all the right places, though she noticed that rarely did anyone ask about her life or activities. "How's the book club going, Mom?" Richard asked suddenly, as if remembering a script he was supposed to follow. Evelyn brightened. "Oh, it's wonderful. We're reading East of Eden this month. Sarah Jenkins, you remember her, she taught English at the high school for 30 years, she's bringing such fascinating insights about the biblical symbolism." "That's nice," Melissa interjected before Evelyn could elaborate. "Noah, please put your phone away at the dinner table." The conversation shifted again, moving away from Evelyn's small world. She felt herself fading into the background of her own dinner party, becoming part of the furniture, present but unnoticed. It wasn't always this way. Thomas had valued her opinions, drawn her into discussions, made space for her voice. But since his passing, she'd watched her relevance to her son diminish gradually, like a slow-moving tide pulling away from shore. After dinner, as Evelyn was preparing to serve her famous apple pie, she realized she'd forgotten the vanilla ice cream in the garage freezer. Michigan winters were cold enough that she often used the detached garage as additional cold storage. During the holidays. "I'll just be a moment," she told the family, slipping on her boots and coat. The ice cream's in the garage freezer. The night air was crisp, her breath forming small clouds as she carefully made her way across the shoveled path to the garage. The door creaked open, another repair she'd been meaning to address. Thomas would have fixed it immediately, but these days, Evelyn had to prioritize which home maintenance issues she could handle and which she needed to hire help for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She retrieved the ice cream and was about to head back when voices drifted through the slightly open kitchen window. Richard and Melissa, speaking in hushed but intense tones. "After New Year's, we need to bring it up," Melissa was saying. "This house is too much for her to manage alone." "I know," Richard's voice sounded tired. "But you know how stubborn she is about this place. Dad built it, and she's convinced she needs to die here or something." "Richard, be practical. She's 73 with arthritis and that heart scare last year. This property is 5 acres. 5. The stairs alone are an accident waiting to happen." Evelyn stood frozen, the cold of the ice cream seeping through her gloves, but she barely noticed. "What about assisted living? The Heritage Gardens has openings, and it's only 20 minutes from us," Melissa continued. "She'd never go for it. You know how independent she is." "Independent?" Melissa's voice took on an edge Evelyn had never heard before. "Is that what we're calling it? Richard, she's becoming dead weight, and you know it. Your father left enough for her care, but not if she insists on maintaining this money pit of a farmhouse." Dead weight. The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow, forcing the air from her lungs. She leaned against the garage wall, suddenly needing support. "Jesus, Melissa, don't call her that." Richard's voice held a note of reproach, but it was weak, performative. He didn't disagree. "Well, what would you call it? She can barely manage the property taxes, let alone the upkeep. And don't think I haven't noticed you writing checks for her emergencies." Evelyn's hand trembled as she clutched the ice cream carton. The emergency Melissa referenced had been a new water heater 3 months ago, hardly a frivolous expense. Yes, Richard had helped, but Evelyn had insisted on a payment plan, which she'd faithfully maintained from her modest pension. "After the holidays," Richard sighed. "We'll talk to her after the holidays. Maybe we can frame it as concern for her safety." "It is concern," Melissa insisted. "But it's also practical. That inheritance from your grandparents should be going toward the kids' college funds, not subsidizing her refusal to downsize." Evelyn had heard enough. She pushed away from the wall, her mind racing. Dead weight. The phrase echoed in her head, each repetition more painful than the last. Was that how her son saw her now? A burden to be managed, an obstacle to his financial plans? She took several deep breaths of the cold night air, forcing composure into her features before returning to the house. Her hands were steady as she served the pie and ice cream, her smile fixed in place as she listened to Emma chatter about her school play. No one seemed to notice the new hollowness behind her eyes or the slight stiffness in her movements. That night, after Richard and his family had left with promises to return the next day for Christmas lunch, Evelyn sat alone in Thomas's old armchair, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. The house creaked and settled around her, sounds she found comforting rather than concerning. This home held 40 years of memories, Thomas building the back deck while she planted perennials along the walkway, Richard learning to ride his bike in the circular driveway, countless birthdays and holidays marked by laughter and togetherness. Dead weight. The cruel assessment hung in the air around her. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the small secretary desk in the corner of the living room. Thomas had built it for her 30th birthday, a beautiful cherrywood piece with intricate dovetail joints and a roll top that still moved smoothly after all these decades. Inside that desk was a folder containing what Thomas had jokingly called their just-in-case papers, wills, insurance policies, property deeds, and one additional document that had never been discussed with Richard. Evelyn rose slowly, her joints protesting after too long in one position. She crossed to the desk and unlocked the roll top, retrieving a blue folder from the back of a drawer. Inside was a letter from their attorney, dated 6 years ago, shortly after Thomas's passing. The letter confirmed the establishment of something Thomas had insisted upon when revising their estate plan, a trust named Mort. Thomas had been a history professor at Michigan State for 35 years, and he'd always had a fondness for wordplay. Mort was French for death, and the Mort Trust was designed as their final act of love, both for each other and for Richard. But it was also a safeguard, created after several concerning conversations with their son following Thomas's diagnosis. Evelyn ran her fingers over Thomas's signature at the bottom of the document. You were right, she whispered to the empty room. You saw it coming before I could. Thomas had noticed Richard's subtle shift in attitude when discussions of inheritance arose during his illness, the slightly too eager questions about the estate, the suggestions about selling the farmhouse. That began even before Thomas had passed. Love him enough to make him earn it, Thomas had told her during one of their final conversations. And love yourself enough to live fully until the end. The Mort Trust contained the majority of their assets, with specific conditions for Richard's inheritance. Conditions that Evelyn, in her grief and optimism about her relationship with her son, had almost forgotten. But tonight's conversation had brought everything into sharp focus. Evelyn returned the folder to its place and closed the desk. Tomorrow was Christmas Day. She would serve the honey-glazed ham and cranberry relish, she would watch her grandchildren open their presents, and she would pretend she hadn't heard her son refer to her as dead weight on Christmas Eve. But after the holidays, there would be changes, not the ones Richard and Melissa were planning, but changes of Evelyn's own design. If her son saw her as nothing more than a financial burden and an obstacle to his inheritance, perhaps it was time to remind him of the conditions of the Mort Trust. Perhaps it was time to reclaim her place in her own life. Evelyn woke early. On Christmas morning, her sleep having been fitful and interrupted by fragments of dreams where she was packing boxes while Richard stood by with a calculator, tallying the value of each item. The phrase, dead weight, had echoed through her subconscious all night, seeping into her bones like the Michigan cold. She moved through her morning routine with deliberate care, finding comfort in the familiar rituals. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma that had greeted her every morning for decades. Outside, fresh snow had fallen overnight, transforming the landscape into a pristine white canvas. The farmhouse looked like something from a Christmas card, the kind Thomas used to carefully select each year, signing each one with both their names in his neat professor's handwriting. As she prepared the ham for the oven, Evelyn found herself taking inventory of her life in a way she hadn't done since Thomas's passing. She wasn't naive about her situation. Yes, the farmhouse required maintenance, and yes, her arthritis made certain tasks more challenging. But she was far from helpless. Her monthly pension from Thomas's university position covered her basic needs. The farm's small apple orchard, which she leased to a local organic grower, provided additional income. Her vegetable garden supplied much of her produce during the growing season, and her book club and volunteer work at the library kept her mind sharp and her social connections intact. Dead weight? The phrase seemed more absurd in the clear light of Christmas morning. Evelyn Monroe had survived the loss of her beloved husband, learned to manage the property on her own, and maintained her independence through determination and careful planning. She was many things, but dead weight was not among them. The sound of car doors slamming announced Richard's family's arrival. Evelyn smoothed her holiday sweater, cranberry red with delicate silver snowflakes, and prepared to greet them with the same warmth she always provided, despite the new understanding that shadowed her heart. As she rinsed the plates, Evelyn's thoughts turned to Thomas and what he might advise in this situation. He'd always been the more forward-thinking of the two, anticipating problems before they fully materialized. The Mort Trust had been his idea, created after he'd observed Richard's subtle but troubling reactions to discussions about inheritance during Thomas's illness. It's not about the money itself, Thomas had explained to her. It's about what money reveals about character. I want to ensure that Richard cares for you because you're his mother, not because there's a financial reward waiting at the end. At the time, Evelyn had thought Thomas was being overly cautious, perhaps even a bit unfair to Richard. Now, hearing her son's true assessment of her as dead weight, she recognized her late husband's wisdom. The front door opened, and Richard reappeared, his expression controlled but his eyes still burning with a mixture of anger and humiliation. The kids and Melissa are waiting in the car, he said stiffly. We're going to head home. Evelyn nodded, drying her hands on a dish towel. I understand. I don't think you do, Richard replied, his voice tight. You've just accused me of only caring about your money, of not valuing you as a person. After everything I've done, the checks for repairs, the visits, the phone calls, how could you think so little of me? Evelyn studied her son's face, searching for the boy she'd raised, the young man who had once shown such promise of becoming like his thoughtful, generous father. I don't want to think poorly of you, Richard, she said softly. But I heard what was said last night. And it wasn't the first time I've sensed that you see me as a burden rather than as your mother. One comment, taken out of context, it wasn't just the comment, Evelyn interrupted gently. It's been a pattern. The way you dismiss my interests. The way you make decisions about my life without consulting me. The way you talk about this house, my home, as nothing but a drain on resources that you believe should ultimately come to you. Richard's jaw tightened. So what happens now? You hold this trust over my head and force me to what? Visit more often? Pretend to care about your community garden? The question broke Evelyn's heart. That he could frame genuine care as a performance, as something to be faked for financial gain, told her everything about how far their relationship had deteriorated. Nothing is being held over your head, Richard, she said. The trust exists to protect both of us, to protect me from being seen as nothing but an obstacle to your inheritance, and to protect you from the person you might become if you only viewed me as a means to financial gain. That's not who I am, Richard insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. I hope not, Evelyn replied. I truly hope not. Because the son I raised, the son your father and I poured our lives into, he would care for me because I'm his mother, not because of what he stands to inherit. Richard looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I should go. Melissa and the kids are waiting. Of course. Evelyn hesitated, then added, please tell Emma I'd still like to help with her Dorothy costume, if she wants. Richard nodded curtly and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. We'll talk after the holidays. When things are calmer. After they'd gone, Evelyn returned to the dining room and sat heavily in Thomas's old chair at the head of the table. The house seemed unnaturally quiet after the tension of the past hour. Outside, the afternoon light was already fading, the short winter day surrendering to evening. She hadn't wanted it to happen this way. Despite everything, Richard was her only child, her family. The distance that had grown between them wasn't solely his fault. Perhaps she'd been too independent after Thomas died, too determined to show she could manage alone, too reluctant to acknowledge her own occasional struggles. But the dead weight comment had stripped away any illusions about how Richard currently saw her. Not as a mother to be cherished in her later years, but as a financial liability to be managed until he could claim his inheritance. Evelyn rose and moved to the living room window, watching as Richard's car disappeared down the long driveway. Christmas was supposed to be about family, about love and connection. Instead, she stood alone in her farmhouse, the truth of her relationship with her son finally laid bare. Yet alongside the sorrow was a surprising sense of clarity. For years, she'd been tiptoeing around Richard's expectations, sensing his impatience, but never confronting it directly. Now, everything was in the open. Painful as it was, there was relief in no longer pretending. And there was something else, a feeling she hadn't anticipated. Strength. Standing up for herself, insisting on her right to make her own choices, refusing to be labeled as dead weight. These actions had awakened something in Evelyn that had been dormant since Thomas's passing. A sense of purpose, of agency, of life still very much worth living on her own terms. She glanced at the secretary desk where the Mort Trust documents were stored. Thomas had named it with his typical scholarly humor, Mort, for death, yes, but also a play on mortgage, a pledge, a promise. The trust wasn't just about money, it was about values, about how people treated each other when material concerns entered the equation. You were right, old friend, Evelyn whispered to Thomas's memory. You saw what I couldn't. But I see it. Now. As the Christmas lights twinkled in the growing darkness, Evelyn made a decision. Tomorrow, she would call Dr. Lawrence and discuss the next steps regarding the trust. She would also contact the library board and the art teacher to confirm the plans for the community garden and art studio. But tonight, she would allow herself to feel the full weight of what had happened, the pain of hearing herself described as a burden, the disappointment of recognizing her son's priorities, the grief of acknowledging how far they'd drifted from the family they once were. And then she would move forward, not as dead weight, but as Evelyn Monroe, 73 years old, still capable, still independent, and still very much alive with purpose. The January thaw came early to western Michigan, unseasonably warm. Days that turned the pristine Christmas snow into gray slush. Evelyn stood at her kitchen window, watching droplets race down the glass like tears. 3 weeks had passed since the disastrous Christmas dinner, 3 weeks of silence from Richard and his family. The words, dead weight, had settled into Evelyn's consciousness, sometimes receding to a whisper, other times roaring back with painful clarity. The telephone sat on the counter beside her, Dr. Lawrence's number scrawled on a notepad next to it. She'd been putting off the call, still hoping that Richard might reach out first, with an apology, an explanation, some acknowledgement of how deeply his words had wounded her. But the days had stretched into weeks with no contact beyond a terse text message on New Year's Day, Happy New Year, Mom. Richard. Not even a phone call, just characters on a screen sent out of obligation. Evelyn finally picked up the receiver and dialed. After 2 rings, a warm, familiar voice answered. Charles Lawrence speaking. Charles, it's Evelyn Monroe. Evelyn. What a pleasant surprise. How are you holding up this winter? Charles had been Thomas's closest colleague, the 2 men sharing adjacent offices in the history department for over 30 years. After Thomas's death, Charles had maintained a respectful distance, checking in occasionally but never intruding on Evelyn's grief. His appointment as trustee of the Mort Trust had been Thomas's way of ensuring objective oversight by someone who understood their values. "I'm calling about the trust, Charles," Evelyn said, moving directly to the purpose of her call. "I think it's time we discussed it actively." There was a brief pause. "I see," Charles replied, his tone shifting to something more formal. "May I ask what's prompted this?" Evelyn took a deep breath and recounted the events of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, the overheard conversation, the confrontation, Richard's reaction to learning that his inheritance was conditional. As she spoke, the pain of it all surfaced again, making her voice waver despite her efforts to remain composed. "I knew Thomas had concerns," Charles said when she'd finished. "It's why he structured the trust as he did. But I had hoped Richard would prove those concerns unfounded." "So had I," Evelyn admitted. "For 7 years, I've tried to believe that the occasional tensions were just normal family friction. But hearing him discuss me as a financial burden, as dead weight," her voice caught on the phrase. "That's deeply troubling," Charles agreed. "Especially given the explicit purpose of the trust. As you know, Thomas was quite specific about ensuring that you were treated with dignity and respect, not as an obstacle to Richard's inheritance." "What happens now?" Evelyn asked. "I don't want to punish Richard. He's still my son. But I also can't pretend I didn't hear what I heard." "The trust provisions are clear," Charles explained. "I'm required to make an annual assessment of Richard's demonstration of genuine care and respect toward you. Based on what you've shared, I would have serious concerns about his current compliance with the trust conditions. And if he's found non-compliant? Then the trust assets would be redirected according to the secondary provisions Thomas established." Evelyn knew those provisions well. If Richard failed to meet the conditions, the bulk of the trust would be divided between several educational charities Thomas had supported, with only a modest portion still passing to Richard. It was Thomas's way of ensuring their values would live on, regardless of their son's choices. "I don't want it to come to that," Evelyn said softly. "Neither would Thomas," Charles assured her. "The trust wasn't designed as punishment, but as incentive, a reminder of the values your family has always stood for. Perhaps this situation can still be salvaged." "How?" "I suggest a meeting, you, Richard, and myself as trustee. Complete transparency about the trust conditions and current concerns. Give Richard the opportunity to understand exactly what's at stake and make an informed choice about his priorities moving forward." Evelyn considered this. A meeting would force the issues into the open, requiring Richard to confront his behavior directly rather than dismissing it as a misunderstanding. But it would also create an undeniable rift, making official what had previously been a private family matter. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. "Take your time," Charles replied. "But Evelyn, remember what Thomas always said, sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to hold them accountable to their better nature." After hanging up, Evelyn moved through the quiet house with restless energy. The conversation with Charles had left her feeling both validated and troubled. The trust provisions were working exactly as Thomas had intended, creating consequences for behavior that diminished her dignity. Yet the thought of formally activating those consequences against her only child filled her with a deep sadness. She climbed the stairs to the small home office that had once been Thomas's domain. The bookshelves still held his collection of historical texts, the desk still positioned to catch the morning light. Evelyn had changed little in this room after his passing, finding comfort in maintaining the space as he had left it. From the bottom drawer of the desk, she retrieved a leather-bound journal, Thomas's final gift to her, presented the week before he died. "For after I'm gone," he told her, "when you need to hear my voice." The journal contained letters Thomas had written during his final months, each addressed to Evelyn and dated so she would know when he intended her to read them. Some were for specific occasions, for our anniversary, for Christmas, while others were more general, for when you feel alone, for when you doubt yourself. Evelyn found the one she was looking for when Richard disappoints you. Thomas had known. Even as he was dying, he had anticipated this moment, this fracture in the relationship between mother and son. Evelyn settled into the desk chair and began to read her husband's careful handwriting. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, our son has done something that has hurt you deeply. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but we both know Richard has always struggled with certain aspects of his character. The materialism, the status-seeking, the calculation that sometimes overtakes his better nature, these were tendencies we noticed even when he was young. We did our best to counter these inclinations with our example, with our values, with our unconditional love. Sometimes it seemed to take, other times, I worried that the world's messages were louder than ours. The finance career, the marriage. To Melissa, a woman who shares his material ambitions, the constant reaching for more, these were not the choices we would have wished for him, though we respected his right to make them. But here is what you must remember, my love, Richard's choices reflect on him, not on you. You were an exemplary mother. You showed him what it means to live with integrity, to value people over possessions, to give generously without expectation of return. If he has chosen a different path, that is his burden to bear, not yours. The Mort Trust exists because I feared this day might come, a day when Richard might see you as an obstacle rather than as the extraordinary woman who gave him life and love. The trust is not meant to punish him, but to protect you and to remind him of what truly matters before it's too late. Be strong in your boundaries, Evelyn. Do not allow our son to diminish your worth or dictate your choices. You have earned the right to live your remaining years exactly as you wish, in the home we built together, pursuing whatever brings you joy. And remember, disappointment in Richard's choices does not negate the love we have for him. We can love him fully while still requiring that he treat you with the respect you deserve. All my love, now and always, Thomas. Tears blurred Evelyn's vision as she finished reading. Thomas had seen so clearly what she had refused to acknowledge, the slow erosion of Richard's regard for her, the growing perception of her as a means to an end rather than as a person of intrinsic value. I miss your wisdom, she whispered. To the empty room, running her fingers over Thomas's handwriting. I miss your strength. But even as she said it, Evelyn recognized that Thomas's strength was still present, in the trust he had established, in the letters he had left, in the values they had shared for 40 years of marriage. And perhaps most importantly, his strength lived on in her, in the resolve now forming as she considered her next steps. She returned the journal to its drawer and went downstairs to the kitchen. The calendar hanging beside the refrigerator showed her schedule for the coming week: book club on Tuesday, volunteer shift at the library on Thursday, meeting with the garden committee on Friday. A life. Her life. Not the life of dead weight, waiting to be managed, but of a woman still engaged with her community, still contributing, still growing. Evelyn picked up the phone again and dialed Richard's number. It went to voicemail, as she had half expected. Richard, it's your mother, she said after the beep. We need to talk about what happened at Christmas and about the Mort Trust. I've spoken with Dr. Lawrence, and he's suggested a meeting with all of us. Please call me back so we can arrange this. I love you, and I believe we can find a way forward that honors both my needs and your father's intentions. She hung up, feeling a curious mixture of apprehension and relief. The first step had been taken. Whether Richard would respond constructively remained to be seen, but Evelyn had done what she could to open the door to resolution. The following morning brought unexpected visitors. Evelyn was tending to her orchid collection in the sunroom when she heard a car in the driveway. Looking out, she saw Richard's Audi, but it wasn't Richard who emerged from the driver's side, it was Emma. With Noah reluctantly following. Evelyn hurried to the front door, confusion and pleasure mingling as she greeted her grandchildren. Emma? Noah? What a wonderful surprise. Emma threw her arms around her grandmother in a fierce hug. Dad doesn't know we're here, she confessed. Immediately. Noah drove us. We borrowed Dad's car while he and Mom are at their fitness class. Evelyn glanced at Noah, who stood awkwardly on the porch, hands shoved in his pockets. At 16, he had recently received his driver's license, though Evelyn was surprised he would risk taking his father's car without permission. You shouldn't have done that, she said, though she couldn't keep the affection from her voice. Your father will be worried. He'll figure it out, Noah shrugged. Emma wouldn't stop pestering me until I agreed to bring her. Said it was an emergency. It is an emergency, Emma insisted, still clinging to Evelyn. Dad and Mom said we couldn't visit you, and that's not fair. We always come see you, and you promised to help me with my Dorothy costume, and then suddenly no one will even talk about why we can't come over. Evelyn felt a pang at the realization that Richard had prohibited the children from visiting her. Using them as pawns in this conflict was a low she hadn't anticipated even from him. Come inside, she said, ushering them in from the cold. I'll make hot chocolate, and we can talk properly. In the kitchen, Emma perched on her usual stool while Noah leaned against the counter, trying to maintain his teenage air of detachment despite clearly being invested in the situation. So what's going on with Dad and Grandma? Noah asked bluntly. As Evelyn said about heating milk for the hot chocolate. He gets all weird whenever your name comes up, and Mom just purses her lips like she ate something sour. Evelyn measured cocoa powder carefully, considering how much to share with her grandchildren. They deserved some explanation for the sudden rift in the family, but she was reluctant to burden them with the full ugly truth. Your father and I had a disagreement at Christmas, she said finally. About my future and about certain financial matters. Is it about the house? Emma asked. Dad's always saying it's too big for you and you should sell it. The house is part of it, Evelyn acknowledged. But it's more complicated than that. It involves something called the Mort Trust, which your grandfather set up before he died. Mort like death in French? Noah asked, surprising Evelyn with his knowledge. Exactly, she smiled. Your grandfather was a professor, after all. He loved his little wordplays. What's the trust for? Noah pressed. Evelyn stirred the heating milk, choosing her words carefully. It contains most of the inheritance that would eventually come to your father. But Grandpa Thomas attached certain conditions to it. What kind of conditions? Emma asked, wide-eyed. Conditions about how I should be treated in my later years, Evelyn explained, keeping her tone neutral. Your grandfather wanted to ensure that my wishes would be respected, that I wouldn't be pressured to make changes I didn't want to make. Noah's eyes narrowed with understanding. And Dad violated those conditions somehow. Evelyn glanced at her grandson, noting the perceptiveness that reminded her so much of Thomas. Behind the teenage facade of indifference was a keen mind that missed little. There was an incident at Christmas, she confirmed. Something was said that suggested your father sees me primarily as a financial concern rather than as his mother. What did he say? Emma demanded. That's between your father and me, Evelyn said gently. What matters is that we need to work through this together, as a family. I've asked him to meet with me and Dr. Lawrence, who oversees the trust. Noah snorted. Good luck with that. Dad's been in a foul mood for weeks. Mom too. They had a big fight last night about the lake house mortgage. Evelyn poured the hot chocolate into mugs, adding a dollop of whipped cream to each. As she handed them to her grandchildren, she noticed Emma's eyes welling with tears. What's wrong, sweetheart? She asked, alarmed. I don't want you to be mad at Dad, Emma said, her voice small. I don't want our family to be broken. Evelyn sat down beside her granddaughter, wrapping an arm around her slender shoulders. Our family isn't broken, Emma. We're just going through a difficult time. Families sometimes disagree, sometimes hurt each other without meaning to. The important thing is that we find a way to talk honestly about what's happened and try to make it right. But what if Dad won't talk to you? Noah asked, his usual bravado momentarily set aside. He's pretty stubborn when he thinks he's right. Then I'll keep trying, Evelyn said simply. Because that's what families do. We don't give up on each other, even when things get hard. The kitchen fell silent save for the occasional sip of hot chocolate. Evelyn watched her grandchildren, these precious extensions of herself and Thomas, innocent bystanders in a conflict not of their making. Their presence in her kitchen, against their father's explicit prohibition, spoke volumes about their love for her and their desire to maintain the family bonds Richard seemed willing to sacrifice. Now, Evelyn said, deliberately lightening her tone, tell me about the school play, Emma. When are rehearsals starting? Emma's face brightened. Next week. But I still don't have a costume, and Mom says we're too busy to work on it. Well, then it's fortunate you came today, Evelyn smiled. Why don't we go upstairs to the sewing room and take your measurements? I think I have some blue gingham that would be perfect for Dorothy's dress. As Evelyn led Emma upstairs, she glanced back at Noah. There are oatmeal cookies in the jar if you're hungry. And feel free to use the TV in the den if you'd like. Thanks, Grandma, he said, the teenage mask slipping just enough to reveal the boy beneath. And I'm sorry about whatever Dad said. He can be a jerk sometimes. He's under a lot of pressure, Evelyn replied, not wanting to encourage criticism of Richard despite everything. Sometimes pressure brings out the worst in people. But it can also be an opportunity to reassess what truly matters. In the sewing room, Evelyn found the blue gingham fabric she'd purchased years ago for a project that had never materialized. As she measured Emma for the Dorothy costume, her mind kept returning to the fact that her grandchildren had defied their father to see her. It was both touching and troubling, evidence of their love, but also of the damage this rift was causing to the family fabric. Grandma, Emma said as Evelyn noted down the measurements, are you going to be okay? Living here all alone, I mean. The question revealed how much the children had likely overheard of their parents' discussions about Evelyn's living situation. I'm more than okay, sweetheart, Evelyn assured her. I have my friends, my volunteer work, my garden plans. And I have you and Noah, even if visits might be a bit more complicated for a while. Dad says this house is too much work for you. Your father is concerned, and I appreciate that, Evelyn said diplomatically. But this is my home, Emma. Your grandfather and I built it together. Every room holds memories that are precious to me. And I'm still perfectly capable of managing it, with occasional help. I could help. Emma offered eagerly. I could come over after school sometimes and help with chores or the garden or whatever you need. Evelyn smiled at her granddaughter's enthusiasm. That's a lovely offer. But right now, I think the most important thing is for you to respect your parents' wishes, even when you don't agree with them. I don't want you getting into trouble on my account. But it's not fair that they won't let us see you. Life isn't always fair, Evelyn acknowledged. But I promise you this situation won't last forever. Your father and I will find a way to work through our differences. In the meantime, we can talk on the phone, and perhaps I can speak with your parents about scheduled visits. Emma looked dubious but nodded reluctantly. Evelyn continued taking measurements, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her conflict with Richard was now affecting the children. This wasn't what Thomas would have wanted, nor what she wanted herself. The sound of a car door slamming outside interrupted their conversation. Emma rushed to the window, her face paling. "It's Dad. He found us." Evelyn set aside her measuring tape and straightened her shoulders. "It's all right, Emma. This is actually a good opportunity. Your father and I need to talk, and now we can do so face to face." "He's going to be so mad," Emma worried, biting her lower lip. "Let me handle your father," Evelyn said with more confidence than she felt. "You go find Noah and wait in the kitchen. Everything will be okay." As Emma hurried to find her brother, Evelyn made her way downstairs to meet Richard. She opened the front door just as he was about to knock, his face flushed with anger. "Mom," he said tersely. "I believe my children are here with my car." "They are," Evelyn confirmed. "They arrived about an hour ago. I was just taking Emma's measurements for her Dorothy costume." Richard's jaw tightened. "They had no right to take my car without permission. And they knew they weren't supposed to come here." "Why is that, Richard?" Evelyn asked, keeping her voice level. "Why have you forbidden your children from visiting their grandmother?" "This isn't the time or place. I think it's exactly the time and place," Evelyn interrupted. "Your children are confused and upset. They don't understand why their father is suddenly treating their grandmother like persona non grata. I think they deserve an explanation, don't you?" Richard hesitated, clearly torn between his anger and the awareness that the situation required delicate handling with the children present. "May I come in?" he asked finally. Evelyn stepped aside to let him enter. In the kitchen, Noah and Emma sat at the counter, both looking apprehensive. Noah had positioned himself slightly in front of his sister, a protective gesture that touched Evelyn deeply. "Car keys, Noah," Richard said, extending his hand. "Now." Noah silently handed over the keys, his expression defiant despite his compliance. "What were you thinking?" Richard demanded. "Taking my car without permission, driving out here when they knew what?" Evelyn interjected. That their grandmother had suddenly become someone they weren't allowed to see? Someone they needed to sneak away to visit, like a shameful secret? Richard turned to his children. "Wait in the car. Your mother and I will deal with your punishment when we get home." "No," Noah said, surprising everyone including himself. "Not until you explain what's going on. Why can't we see Grandma anymore? What happened at Christmas?" Richard looked taken aback by his son's defiance. "This is adult business, Noah. It doesn't concern you." "Except it does," Emma piped up, emboldened by her brother's stance. "Because we love Grandma, and you're trying to keep us away from her." Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that again reminded Evelyn painfully of Thomas. The resemblance between father and son had never seemed more pronounced, or more ironic, given how far Richard had strayed from the values Thomas had lived by. "Your grandmother and I have a disagreement about her living situation," Richard said finally. "And about certain financial matters that have come to light." "You mean the Mort Trust?" Noah asked bluntly. Richard's head snapped up. "What do you know about that?" "Grandma told us Grandpa set it up before he died," Noah shrugged. "With conditions about how she should be treated. And I suppose she also told you I violated those conditions?" Richard's voice was tight with anger. "She didn't say that," Emma defended. "She just said you had a disagreement and needed to work things out." Richard turned to Evelyn, his expression accusing. "Are you turning my children against me now?" "Of course not," Evelyn replied calmly. "They asked questions, and I gave them age-appropriate answers without details that would damage their relationship with you. I would never undermine you as their father, Richard, regardless of our current differences." Some of the tension seemed to leave Richard's shoulders at her words. For a moment, Evelyn caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his eyes, a flash of the more thoughtful man she knew still existed somewhere beneath the ambition and material focus that had come to dominate his adult life. "Kids, wait in the car," he said, his tone gentler than before. "I need to speak with your grandmother privately." This time, Noah and Emma complied, though not without exchanging worried glances with Evelyn. As they filed out, Emma turned back to give her grandmother a quick hug. "Don't forget about my costume," she whispered. "I won't," Evelyn promised. "We'll figure something out." When the front door closed behind the children, Richard turned to Evelyn. You had no right to discuss the trust with them. They asked direct questions, and I gave them honest but limited answers, Evelyn replied. I'm not going to lie to them, Richard. They deserve better than that. And what about me? Don't I deserve better than having my financial arrangements with my mother discussed with my children? This isn't just about financial arrangements, Evelyn countered. It's about how you view me, how you speak about me when you think I can't. Here. It's about referring to your mother as dead weight on Christmas Eve. Richard had the grace to look uncomfortable. I told you Melissa was just frustrated. It was a poor choice of words, but it doesn't reflect how I actually feel about you. Doesn't it? Evelyn asked quietly. Because from where I stand, it seems to align perfectly with your attitude toward me for the past several years. I'm not a person to you anymore, Richard. I'm a problem to be managed, an obstacle between you and what you believe you're entitled to. That's not fair. Perhaps not. But neither is prohibiting your children from seeing their grandmother because you're angry about a trust your father established to protect me from exactly this kind of situation. Richard was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, I got your message about meeting with Dr. Lawrence. And I'll do it. Not because I agree with what you're doing, but because I want to resolve this situation. For the children's sake, if nothing else. Evelyn nodded, relief washing through her despite the tension that still hung between them. Thank you. I think it's the right step forward. Richard moved toward the door, then paused. The children can visit you. Supervised, with either myself or Melissa present. It wasn't a complete concession, but it was a start. I appreciate that, Evelyn said. And Richard? I want you to know that I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to salvage our relationship before it's damaged beyond repair. Richard didn't respond to this, merely nodded curtly before leaving. Through the window, Evelyn watched as he spoke briefly to Noah and Emma in the car, his expression serious but no longer angry. Then they drove away, leaving Evelyn alone once more with the weight of unresolved conflict. She returned to the kitchen and began tidying up the remnants of the hot chocolate and cookies. The unexpected visit from her grandchildren, followed by the tense encounter with Richard, had left her emotionally drained but also strangely hopeful. For the first time since Christmas, there had been real communication, however difficult. And Richard had agreed to the meeting with Dr. Lawrence. It was a small step, but in the right direction. As Thomas had written in his letter, disappointment in Richard's choices didn't negate the love they had for him. Evelyn still believed her son could find his way back to the values they had tried to instill, if not for her sake, then perhaps for Emma and Noah, who were watching and learning. From every interaction, every decision. Outside, the January thaw continued, melting away the remnants of Christmas snow to reveal the dormant earth beneath. Soon, it would be time to begin planning the spring garden in earnest. Evelyn found herself looking forward to the renewal that would come with the changing seasons, in her garden, in her life, and perhaps even in her relationship with her son. The conference room at Lawson and Briggs law offices felt unnecessarily formal for a family discussion, but Charles Lawrence had insisted on neutral territory. Evelyn sat with her hands folded on the polished mahogany table, watching snowflakes drift past the 10th floor window. February had arrived with a vengeance, burying western Michigan under 8 inches of fresh snow overnight. The roads had been treacherous, but Evelyn had been determined not to postpone this meeting. 7 weeks had passed since Christmas, 7 weeks of strained phone calls and supervised visits with her grandchildren. It was time to address the elephant in the room. The door opened, and Richard entered, snowflakes still clinging to the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat. He looked tired, Evelyn thought, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying unresolved conflicts for too long. Mom, he nodded stiffly, taking the seat across from her. Dr. Lawrence hasn't arrived yet? He'll be here momentarily, Evelyn replied. His assistant said he was finishing up a call. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Evelyn resisted the urge to fill it with small talk, questions about the children or comments about the weather that would only highlight the strained nature of their relationship. Instead, she waited, studying her son's face and wondering when they had become strangers to each other. Charles Lawrence arrived 5 minutes later, his bow tie slightly askew and his white hair disheveled from the wind outside. At 78, he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned the value of patience, both in his academic career and in his personal life. Evelyn, Richard, thank you both for coming, he said, settling into the chair at the head of the table. Especially in this weather. I apologize for the delay. He placed a leather portfolio on the table and opened it to reveal several documents. I've brought copies of the Mort Trust for us to review together. I think it's important that we all have absolute clarity about its provisions and purposes. Richard shifted in his seat. Before we begin, I want to state for the record that I find this entire situation unnecessarily adversarial. My mother and I have a disagreement about her living arrangements, a concern that comes from genuine worry about her welfare. Bringing in lawyers and trust provisions feels like an overreaction. Charles regarded Richard thoughtfully over his reading glasses. I understand your perspective, Richard. But as the trustee appointed by your father, I have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that the trust is administered according to its terms. And those terms are explicitly tied to the nature of your relationship with your mother. A relationship that shouldn't be defined by financial incentives, Richard countered. On that, we completely agree, Charles said mildly. Which is precisely why your father established the trust as he did. He slid copies of the trust document across the table to both Evelyn and Richard. I'd like to direct your attention to Section 4, Paragraph B, which outlines the conditions for distribution. Richard reluctantly pulled the document closer, his expression guarded. Evelyn had already reviewed her copy numerous times since Christmas, but she followed along as Charles read aloud. The trustee shall distribute the principal of the Mort Trust to Richard Thomas Monroe only upon determination that Richard has demonstrated genuine care, respect, and support for Evelyn Grace Monroe throughout her lifetime. Such determination shall be made solely by the trustee, based on observed interactions, communications, and behaviors that reflect the values of dignity, autonomy, and familial respect that Thomas and Evelyn Monroe have endeavored to instill. Charles paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing. Should the trustee determine that Richard has failed to demonstrate such care and respect, particularly with regard to Evelyn's autonomy in decisions affecting her quality of life, residence, or financial independence, then the principal of the trust shall be distributed as follows: 20%, 20%, to Richard Thomas Monroe, and 80%, 80%, to the charitable organizations listed in Schedule A. Richard's jaw tightened. My father really believed I would need financial incentives to treat my own mother with respect. I don't think that's quite right, Charles replied. Thomas didn't create the trust because he believed you would mistreat your mother for financial gain. He created it because he feared you might convince yourself that controlling her choices was in her best interest, that your judgment should supersede hers, especially as she aged. Is that so unreasonable? Richard asked, frustration evident in his voice. Children often need to make difficult decisions for aging parents. Mom is 73, living alone on 5 acres, in a house with stairs and maintenance issues. Is it really so wrong to suggest that might not be the best arrangement? It's not the suggestion itself that's problematic, Evelyn interjected quietly. It's the way you've approached it, discussing me as dead weight, making plans for my future without consulting me, prohibiting my grandchildren from visiting when I didn't immediately agree with your assessment. Richard flinched at the phrase dead weight, but his expression remained defensive. One poorly chosen phrase, spoken in a private moment of frustration, and suddenly I'm cast as the villain who doesn't care about his mother's welfare. Richard, Charles said, his tone gentle but firm, this isn't about casting anyone as a villain. It's about recognizing that your approach has violated the spirit of what your father intended to protect, your mother's dignity and autonomy. So what happens now? Richard demanded. You declare me in violation of the trust, redirect millions to charity, and leave my children's education funds decimated? Is that what you both want? Of course not, Evelyn said, dismayed by his framing. Richard, this isn't about punishing you. It's about finding a way forward that respects both your concerns and my choices. Charles nodded in agreement. No decisions have been made regarding the trust distributions. That's why we're here today, to address the current situation and establish a path forward that honors Thomas's intentions. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. I'm listening. I propose a 6-month period of realignment, Charles said. During this time, Richard, you would demonstrate respect for your mother's autonomy while finding appropriate ways to address any legitimate concerns about her welfare. At the end of the 6 months, I would make a new assessment regarding compliance with the trust conditions. And what exactly would this realignment entail? Richard asked. Regular, respectful communication. No unilateral decisions about your mother's living situation or finances. No restrictions on her relationship with your children. And a genuine effort to understand and support her wishes, even when they differ from what you might prefer. Richard was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the trust document before him. Finally, he looked up at Evelyn. And what do you want, Mom? Really want, not just to spite me or assert your independence. The question surprised Evelyn with its directness. I want to live in my home for as long as I am able to do so safely, she said without hesitation. I want to implement the plans I've made for the community garden and art studio. I want unrestricted access to my grandchildren. And most importantly, I want my son back, the son who sees me as a person of value, not as a problem to be managed or an obstacle to his inheritance. Something shifted in Richard's expression, a softening, a moment of genuine reflection. I never meant to make you feel like a problem, he said quietly. I worry about you being alone in that house. I worry about you falling, or having a medical emergency with no one around to help. Is it so wrong to want you to be safe? Of course not, Evelyn acknowledged. But there are many ways to address safety concerns without requiring me to give up my home and independence. We could explore those together, if you're willing. Such as a medical alert system, regular check-ins with neighbors, home modifications to reduce fall risks, perhaps even a part-time companion a few days a week. Evelyn leaned forward, holding her son's gaze. I'm not opposed to making changes, Richard. I'm opposed to having changes forced upon me without my input or consent. Charles nodded approvingly. This is exactly the kind of constructive dialogue Thomas hoped would result from the trust's conditions. Not adversarial, but collaborative, focused on solutions that respect both Evelyn's autonomy and legitimate safety concerns. Richard looked between them, his expression still guarded but no longer openly hostile. And if I agree to the 6-month realignment, what assurances do I have that you won't simply declare me non-compliant at the end of it, regardless of my efforts? The same assurance your father had when he appointed me trustee, Charles replied. My commitment to fairness. And to the true intent of the trust. I have no interest in disinheriting you, Richard. I have every interest in seeing your relationship with your mother heal and strengthen. The room fell silent as Richard considered this. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the city into a landscape of soft whites and grays. Evelyn watched her son, remembering the little boy who had once run to her with skinned knees and broken toys, trusting her to make things right. How had they come so far from that innocent trust? All right, Richard said finally. 6 months. I'll demonstrate genuine care and respect according to your parameters. But I want to acknowledge that my concerns about Mom's living situation come from a place of genuine worry, not from some calculated effort to control her for financial gain. I believe you, Evelyn said softly. I've never thought you were intentionally cruel, Richard. I think you've convinced yourself that you know what's best for me, and in doing so, you've stopped seeing me as capable of making my own choices. Richard's gaze dropped to the table. Perhaps there's some truth to that, he admitted reluctantly. Charles closed his portfolio with a decisive motion. Then we have an agreement. 6 months of realignment, beginning today. I'll check in with both of you monthly to assess progress and address any concerns. As they gathered their coats to leave, Charles pulled Evelyn aside. Thomas would be proud of you, he said quietly. Standing your ground while still leaving the door open for reconciliation, that's exactly what he hoped you would do. I hope it's enough, Evelyn replied, watching Richard shrug into his overcoat. I don't want to lose my son over this. You won't, Charles assured her. The Richard who truly cares about you is still in there. This process will help bring him back to the surface. The drive home from Grand Rapids was treacherous, snow still falling heavily and visibility poor. Evelyn drove with careful concentration, her mind replaying the meeting. It had gone better than she'd feared but not as well as she'd hoped. Richard had agreed to the realignment period, but his compliance felt grudging, motivated more by financial considerations than by genuine understanding of how his behavior had hurt her. Still, it was a start. 6 months was time enough for barriers to soften, for new patterns to emerge, for her son to remember the values that had shaped his childhood. Perhaps, as Charles suggested, the real Richard, the one capable of seeing beyond material concerns to the heart of what mattered, would re-emerge through this process. As Evelyn turned onto the long driveway leading to her farmhouse, she was surprised to see another vehicle already parked near the porch, a familiar SUV that belonged to Sarah Jenkins, her closest friend from the book club. Sarah stood on the covered porch, stomping snow from her boots as Evelyn pulled up. Sarah? What are you doing here in this weather? Evelyn called as she carefully made her way up the slippery walk. Waiting for you, obviously, Sarah replied with a grin. I figured you'd need a friendly ear after that meeting with Richard. And I brought reinforcements. She held up a bag that Evelyn knew would contain a bottle of wine and probably something. Chocolate. Evelyn felt a rush of gratitude for this woman who had been her friend for over 30 years, through Thomas's illness and death, through the empty nest years, through all the small and large transitions of later life. You're a godsend, Evelyn said as they entered the warmth of the house. But how did you know about the meeting? You told me last week at book club, Sarah reminded her, unwinding her scarf. And unlike some people in their 70s, I still have an excellent memory. Evelyn laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. It felt good to laugh after the tension of the morning. So? Sarah prompted as they settled in the kitchen. How did it go? Did Richard come to his senses? Or is he still playing the entitled heir apparent? Somewhere in between, Evelyn admitted, filling the kettle for tea. We've agreed to a 6-month period of realignment, as Charles called it. Richard will respect my autonomy, and I'll consider reasonable safety measures for living alone. Sarah looked skeptical as she unpacked her bag, revealing not just wine but also a homemade coffee cake. And you believe he'll follow through? I have to hope so, Evelyn replied. He's still my son, Sarah. Despite everything. Sarah's expression softened. I know, dear. And for your sake, I hope he rises to the occasion. But hope works better. With a backup plan. Which is partly why I'm here. Oh? The library board met yesterday, Sarah explained, cutting 2 generous slices of coffee cake. We've secured the grant for the community garden project. Full funding, ready to begin as soon as the ground thaws. Evelyn nearly dropped the teacup. She was holding. Sarah, that's wonderful news. I wasn't expecting to hear until March. The foundation had an unexpected surplus from last year that needed to be allocated before the end of their fiscal year. Our proposal was shovel-ready, so to speak. Sarah looked pleased with herself. Which means you can move forward with your plans regardless of how this realignment with Richard progresses. The kettle whistled, and Evelyn poured water over the tea bags, her mind racing with possibilities. The community garden had been a dream she'd shared with Thomas in their later years together, a way to use part of their property to benefit the wider community while maintaining ownership of the land they'd loved. The timing couldn't be better, she said, bringing the tea to the table. Richard needs to see that I'm not just clinging to this property out of sentimentality or stubbornness. I have real plans, meaningful ways to use it that benefit others. Exactly, Sarah nodded. And, speaking of plans, I've been thinking about your safety concerns. My nephew Jeremy installs those medical alert systems professionally. He could come out next week to give you a quote. Might be good to show Richard you're taking his concerns seriously, even if you're rejecting his particular solution. Evelyn felt a surge of affection for her practical, proactive friend. Sarah Jenkins, what would I do without you? Muddle through just fine, I expect, Sarah replied with a wink. But it's more fun this way, isn't it? 2 stubborn old women. Showing the world we've still got plenty to contribute. They spent the afternoon reviewing the garden plans and discussing strategies for the coming 6 months. Sarah, who had navigated her own difficult family dynamics following her divorce years earlier, offered insights that Evelyn found invaluable. The key, Sarah advised, is to be flexible about the how while remaining firm about the what. You're willing to adapt how you live independently, but not whether you live independently. Make that distinction clear to Richard at every opportunity. By the time Sarah left late that afternoon, Evelyn felt more centered and purposeful than she had since Christmas. The meeting with Richard and Charles had established a framework for potential reconciliation, but Sarah had reminded her that her life and plans had value beyond their family conflict. That evening, Evelyn sat at Thomas's old desk and began a letter, not to Richard, but to Emma and Noah. Despite Richard's agreement to lift restrictions on her seeing the grandchildren, she sensed it might be some time before visits became truly relaxed and natural again. In the meantime, she wanted them to know they remained central in her thoughts. My dearest Emma and Noah, she wrote, her cursive flowing across the page as Thomas had taught her during their courtship, when handwritten letters were their primary means of communication between college terms. By now, your father has likely told you about our meeting today and the agreement we've reached. I want you both to know how much it meant to me that you came to visit last month, even though the circumstances were not ideal. Your courage in seeking to maintain our connection despite adult conflict speaks volumes about the kind of people you are becoming. Over the next 6 months, your father and I will be working to rebuild trust and understanding between us. This may sometimes be awkward or uncomfortable, but I want you to remember that family disagreements, even serious ones, don't diminish the love we share. Your grandfather used to say that the most important relationships are the ones worth fighting for, not against each other, but for the relationship itself. Emma, I've enclosed some sketches for your Dorothy costume. When you're able to visit next, we'll start working on it together. The blue gingham is waiting, and I found the perfect pattern for those ruby slippers. Noah, I noticed your interest in the Mort Trust and its provisions. Your grandfather would have appreciated your curiosity. He valued education above almost everything else and believed that understanding the why behind decisions was essential to making good choices. When you visit, I'll show you some of his journals from his teaching days. I think you might find his perspectives interesting. Both of you, please remember that whatever tensions exist between the adults in your life, you are never responsible for fixing them. Your job is to grow, learn, and become the remarkable people you are already showing yourselves to be. All my love, always, Grandma. Evelyn sealed the letter in an envelope, planning to mail it the following day. Writing to her grandchildren had clarified something important. This conflict with Richard wasn't just about defending her own dignity and choices. It was about modeling for Emma and Noah how to navigate difficult relationships with integrity and grace, how to stand firm in one's values while remaining open to reconciliation. Thomas would have understood this broader purpose. He had always taken the long view, considering how their actions and choices would ripple outward to affect others, particularly the younger generations who learned from their example. With this thought warming her, Evelyn prepared for bed. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and a full moon cast blue-white light across the transformed landscape. The farmhouse stood solid against the winter night, a testament to 40 years of memories, to choices made and lives shared. Not dead weight at all, but a living legacy, one Evelyn was determined to honor in her own way, on her own terms. As February gave way to March, the 6-month realignment period began to take tangible shape. Richard's initial approach was formal, almost clinical. Weekly phone calls that felt like items checked off a list, supervised visits with the grandchildren that lacked the easy warmth of previous years. But as the weeks passed, small changes emerged. The first significant shift came in mid-March, when Richard arrived for a Sunday visit without Melissa, bringing only Emma and Noah. She has a charity committee meeting, he explained somewhat stiffly as they settled in the living room. I thought we'd come anyway, rather than canceling. Evelyn recognized this as the olive branch it was. Richard was demonstrating that his commitment to restoring regular contact between Evelyn and the grandchildren wasn't dependent on Melissa's schedule or approval. I'm glad you did, she said simply. I've been experimenting with a new cookie recipe I think the children might enjoy critiquing. Emma brightened immediately. Is it those lemon ones you were telling me about? With white chocolate chips, Evelyn confirmed. They need expert tasters. Noah, now 17 and increasingly comfortable in his lanky frame, looked up from his phone with interest. I volunteer as tribute, he said with a hint of a smile. As the children headed to the kitchen, Richard lingered in the living room, his gaze moving over the familiar surroundings with a new attentiveness. You've made some changes, he observed, noting the rearranged furniture that had created a clearer path through the room. Sarah's nephew installed a medical alert system last week, Evelyn explained. And while he was here, he suggested some simple modifications to reduce fall risks. Moving the furniture, securing the area rugs, installing additional handrails on the stairs. Richard looked genuinely surprised. You didn't mention this on our calls. I wanted to show you rather than tell you, Evelyn replied. Actions speak louder than words, after all. They do, Richard acknowledged. After a pause, he added, it looks like you're taking the safety concerns seriously. I always took them seriously, Richard. I just wanted to address them in ways that preserved my independence. Richard nodded slowly. I can see that now. It was a small admission, but it felt like a significant step. For the first time since Christmas, Richard was acknowledging that her approach to aging in place might have validity, that solutions existed beyond the binary choice of selling the farmhouse or risking her safety. The visit progressed more comfortably than previous ones. Emma showed Evelyn her progress memorizing lines for the school play. Noah reluctantly but accurately played a piece on the piano that Evelyn had taught him years earlier, and they all enjoyed the experimental cookies, which were deemed officially amazing by Emma and not bad by Noah, high praise from a teenage boy. When it was time to leave, Richard lingered on the porch after the children had gone to the car. The medical alert system, he said hesitantly. Was it expensive? Not particularly, Evelyn replied. My Medicare Advantage plan covered part of it, and the monthly monitoring fee is reasonable. Sarah's nephew gave me a good rate. Richard nodded, looking out at the winter-bare trees that lined the driveway. Mom, I've been thinking about what Dr. Lawrence said, about how Dad structured the trust because he feared I might convince myself that controlling your choices was in your best interest. Yes? I think he may have had a point. The admission seemed to cost Richard some effort. It's easy to conflate what's convenient with what's right, especially when you can justify it as concern. Evelyn felt a flutter of hope at this moment. Of self-reflection. Your father was insightful about human nature. He always said our most dangerous blind spots are the ones disguised as virtues. He would know, Richard said with a hint of his old smile. He spent 40 years studying history's mistakes. After a pause, he added, I'm trying, Mom, to see things from your perspective. To respect your choices, even when they're not what I would choose for you. I know you are, Evelyn said softly. And it means more than you can imagine. As Richard drove away with the children, Evelyn remained on the porch, watching until the car disappeared around the bend. The interaction hadn't been perfect, there was still a guardedness to Richard, a careful measuring of words, but it was progress. Real progress, rooted in the beginning of genuine understanding rather than mere compliance with the trust conditions. Perhaps Thomas had been right about the power of the Mort Trust after all. Not as financial leverage, but as a mirror that forced Richard to confront the gap between his professed values and his actual behavior. A mirror that, just possibly, was helping him find his way back to the son he was meant to be. April unfurled across western Michigan in a riot of pale green buds and early daffodils, the landscape gradually shaking off winter's grip. Evelyn stood at the edge of the east field, watching as volunteer crews marked out plots for the community garden. Yellow stakes connected by bright orange string created a grid across the thawing earth, transforming what had long been an unused portion of her property into something vibrant with possibility. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, coming to stand beside her. As head of the library board's garden committee, Sarah had taken the lead in organizing the project, bringing together volunteers from the local high school's environmental club, the community college's sustainable agriculture program, and several retired farmers eager to share their knowledge. "It's even better than I imagined," Evelyn replied, her voice catching slightly. "Thomas would have loved seeing this." "He would indeed," Sarah agreed. "Though he'd probably be out there lecturing the students on the historical significance of Victory Gardens or something equally professorial." Evelyn laughed. "You knew him well." The sound of a car on the gravel driveway drew their attention. Richard's Audi appeared around the bend, a surprise on this Tuesday morning when he would normally be at work. More surprising still was that he was alone, no Melissa, no children. "Unexpected company," Sarah murmured. "Want me to make myself scarce?" "Not at all," Evelyn replied. "Richard should see the garden project taking shape. It's important he understands this isn't just a whim." Richard approached across the field, his polished loafers looking decidedly out of place among the stakes and half-turned earth. He nodded a greeting to Sarah before turning to Evelyn. "I tried calling, but your line was busy," he said. "I was in the area for a client meeting and thought I'd stop by." "Perfect timing," Evelyn replied. "We're just marking out the community garden plots." "Sarah, you remember my son Richard?" "Of course," Sarah smiled, extending her hand. "You probably don't remember, but I taught your senior English class the year your father was on sabbatical in England." "Mrs. Jenkins," Richard said, recognition dawning. "You had us read The Great Gatsby and write essays from different characters' perspectives." Sarah looked pleased. "I'm impressed you remember. That was, what, 28 years ago?" 27. Richard corrected with a small smile. "And it was a memorable assignment. I wrote from Gatsby's father's perspective, how it felt to learn his son had created an entirely fictional life." Evelyn watched this exchange with interest. She hadn't known that Sarah had taught Richard, nor that the assignment had made such an impression. It was a glimpse of the thoughtful young man her son had once been, before financial ambitions had begun to overshadow other values. "Well, I'll leave you two to catch up," Sarah said after a moment. "Evelyn, the rototiller is being delivered tomorrow morning. I'll be here to supervise." As Sarah headed back toward the volunteer crew, Richard surveyed the activity with undisguised curiosity. "So this is the community garden you mentioned. It's bigger than I expected." 48 individual plots, plus a communal herb garden and demonstration area for the educational programs, Evelyn explained, warming to the topic. "The library received a grant that covers all the initial setup costs, irrigation, soil amendments, tool shed, even a small greenhouse for starting seedlings. And the ongoing maintenance? Plot fees will cover most of it. Each family or individual who receives a plot pays a small annual fee and commits to certain community work hours. The library will manage 4 plots for their educational programs. And I'm keeping 2 for myself." Richard nodded slowly, taking it all in. "It's an ambitious project. Life should remain ambitious at every age, don't you think?" Evelyn asked. "Otherwise, what's the point?" Something shifted in Richard's expression, a moment of genuine consideration rather than the guarded assessment she'd grown accustomed to. "Dad used to say something similar. The day you stop being curious is the day you start dying." He lived by that philosophy until the very end, Evelyn agreed. Even in hospice, he was reading new books, asking the nurses about their lives, learning everything he could about the medications they were giving him. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the volunteers work. It was the first time since Christmas that they'd mentioned Thomas without tension underlying the conversation. "You didn't come all this way just to see the garden project," Evelyn said finally. "What's on your mind, Richard?" He hesitated, hands in his pockets, gaze still fixed on the activity in the field. I've been doing some thinking about our situation. About the Mort Trust, about our disagreements since Christmas. And I owe you an apology. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been rehearsing them but still found them difficult to deliver. A real one, not the conditional non-apologies I've been offering. Evelyn turned to face him fully, surprised by this direct approach. I'm listening. I was wrong to call you dead weight, even in a private conversation with Melissa. I was wrong to make plans for your future without consulting you. And I was wrong to use the children as leverage when you didn't immediately agree with those plans. Richard met her gaze directly, his expression unguarded for the first time in months. I convinced myself I was acting out of concern for your welfare, but the truth is, I was focused on what was convenient and financially advantageous for me. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and uncomfortable. Evelyn felt a complex surge of emotions, validation that her perceptions had been accurate, relief that Richard could finally acknowledge it, and a deep sadness that they had reached this point at all. What brought about this realization? She asked quietly. Richard glanced back toward the garden project, where high school students were laughing as they struggled to keep a measuring line straight. Partly seeing all this, concrete evidence that you have plans and purpose for this property beyond just living here. He paused, then continued with evident difficulty. But mostly it was a conversation with Noah last week. He asked me point blank if I was only being nice to you because of the money in the trust. The fact that my 17-year-old son could even ask that question. Richard shook his head. It made me take a hard look at how my behavior must appear from the outside. And I didn't like what I saw. Evelyn's heart ached for both her son and her grandson, for Noah's perception and courage in asking such a direct question, and for Richard's painful self-recognition. It takes integrity to admit when you've been wrong, she said gently. Your father would be proud of that. Would he? Richard looked skeptical. I'm not sure he'd be proud of much about me these days. The career I've chosen, the values I've prioritized, they're not exactly aligned with what he taught. He was proud of your intelligence and drive, Evelyn corrected. He worried about your priorities sometimes, yes. But he never stopped believing in your capacity to choose wisely when it really mattered. Richard absorbed this, his gaze distant. The irony is, all these years I've been chasing financial security, convinced it was the responsible thing to do. The lake house, private schools for the kids, the country club membership, I told myself it was about providing for my family, creating opportunities for my children. And now? Now I wonder if I've been teaching them exactly the wrong lessons. Richard ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture that always reminded Evelyn of Thomas. When Noah asked about the trust, he wasn't just questioning my motives with you. He was questioning the whole value system I've been modeling for him. Evelyn considered her response carefully. This moment felt pivotal, a genuine opening for reconciliation, but one that required truth rather than easy platitudes. It's never too late to realign your actions with your deeper values, she said finally. Your father believed that until the day he died. It's why he established the Mort Trust the way he did, not to control you from beyond the grave, but to remind you of what he knew mattered most to the man you truly are. Richard nodded slowly. I've been angry about the trust, feeling manipulated, judged. But I'm starting to understand what Dad was trying to do. He saw a weakness in me that I didn't want to acknowledge. A call from the garden area interrupted their conversation. One of the volunteers needed Sarah's input on the layout, and she was waving for Evelyn to join them as well. I should go help, Evelyn said. Would you like to come along? See the plans up close? Richard glanced down at his business attire, then shrugged with a small smile. Why not? These shoes were due for a cleaning anyway. As they walked together toward the garden site, Evelyn felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since before Christmas. Richard's apology and self-reflection represented more progress than she had dared hope for, just 3 months into the 6-month realignment period. There was still work to do, trust to rebuild, patterns to change, but for the first time, she believed they might truly find their way back to a relationship built on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. The transformation continued to unfold over the following weeks, not in dramatic moments but in small, consistent actions that revealed Richard's genuine commitment to change. He began stopping by the farmhouse regularly on his way home from work, sometimes just for 15 minutes to check in, other times staying longer to help with a repair or to discuss the progress of the garden project. One evening in late April. He arrived with a stack of papers and a determined expression. "I've been researching something I think might interest you," he said as they settled in the kitchen. "It's called a life estate." "I'm familiar with the concept," Evelyn replied. "Thomas and I considered it when we were updating our estate plan after his diagnosis. Then it would allow you to legally remain in this house for the rest of your life, while transferring the eventual ownership to whoever you designate." Richard laid out the papers on the table. "I've had my firm's estate planning department draw up some options for how it could work." Evelyn studied him thoughtfully. "Richard, are you suggesting I transfer the eventual ownership of this property to you while retaining a life estate for myself?" "Not necessarily. To me," Richard clarified quickly. "It could be to the children directly, or to a trust for their benefit. The point is, it would give you absolute legal protection to remain here as long as you wish, while also creating clarity about what happens to the property eventually." "And what prompted this research?" Richard met her gaze directly. "I want you to know that my respect for your autonomy isn't contingent on the 6-month realignment period or Dr. Lawrence's assessment. This would provide you legal protection regardless of what happens with the Mort Trust." The gesture touched Evelyn deeply. It represented exactly the kind of thinking Thomas had hoped to inspire, not just compliance with the letter of the trust conditions, but a genuine embrace of its spirit. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll review these options carefully. It's something worth considering." Richard nodded, seeming relieved by her receptiveness. "There's no rush. I just wanted you to know I'm thinking about solutions that honor both your wishes and practical considerations for the future." As April blended into May, the community garden burst into productive life. Each weekend brought a flurry of activity as plot holders planted their seedlings and established their growing spaces. The library's educational programs began, bringing groups of schoolchildren to learn about sustainable agriculture and food systems. Emma's school play, The Wizard of Oz, opened to enthusiastic applause from the community. Evelyn sat proudly in the audience, watching her granddaughter spin across the stage in the blue gingham dress they had created together, ruby slippers catching the light with each carefully choreographed step. Richard and Melissa sat beside her, and if Melissa's smile seemed somewhat forced, Richard's pride in his daughter was genuine and unreserved. After the performance, as families gathered in the school gymnasium for refreshments, Evelyn found herself approached by Carmen Martinez, Emma's drama teacher. "Mrs. Monroe? I'm Carmen Martinez, Emma's teacher. I wanted to thank you personally for your work on her costume. It's absolutely beautiful, far beyond what most parents manage to put together." "It was a joy to make," Evelyn replied warmly. "Emma and I worked on it together. She's quite talented with a needle and thread." "She mentioned you're converting an old barn into an art studio," Carmen continued. "I'm always looking for new spaces to hold summer drama workshops. The school auditorium is unavailable during July and August due to renovations." Evelyn felt a spark of excitement at the unexpected opportunity. "The studio won't be fully ready until late June, but it would be perfect for drama workshops. We're installing proper lighting, and the main space is quite open. Would you be open to discussing a possible rental arrangement? The drama department has a small budget for summer programming." "Let me give you my number," Evelyn offered. "I'd love to explore the possibility." As they exchanged contact information, Evelyn noticed Richard watching from across the room, a thoughtful expression on his face. When Carmen moved on to speak with other parents, he approached. "Making plans for the art studio already?" he asked, but his tone held curiosity rather than criticism. "An unexpected opportunity," Evelyn explained. "Emma's drama teacher is looking for summer workshop space." Richard nodded. "It makes sense. You've always had a knack for seeing possibilities where others don't." The simple acknowledgement of her vision and capabilities felt like a precious gift after months of being treated as if her age had diminished her competence. "Your father used to say the same thing," she replied with a smile. "He claimed it was why he fell in love with me. I saw possibilities in a shy history graduate student that no one else recognized." Richard's expression softened. "He was lucky to have you. We all are." The moment was interrupted by Emma's arrival, still in her Dorothy costume, her face flushed with excitement. "Grandma, did you see when I did the twirl during somewhere over the rainbow? That was the special move we practiced." "I saw it, sweetheart. It was perfect," Evelyn assured her, embracing her granddaughter. "You made a wonderful Dorothy." "Thanks to you," Emma said. "Everyone loved the costume." Ms. Martinez asked if you made it professionally. "High praise indeed," Richard commented. "Perhaps you found another revenue stream for your retirement, Mom." The teasing remark, free from the undercurrent of judgment that had characterized their interactions for so long, made Evelyn laugh. I think I'll stick to community gardens and art studios for now. Costume design might be one activity too many, even for me. The easy banter continued through the evening, and for the first time since Christmas, their family interactions felt natural rather than forced. Even Melissa seemed less tense, joining the conversation without the defensive edge that had become her hallmark in Evelyn's presence. As May progressed toward June, the scheduled midpoint assessment with Dr. Lawrence approached. The meeting was set for the first week of June, marking 3 months since their initial agreement. Evelyn found herself looking forward to it rather than dreading it, a chance to officially acknowledge the progress that had been made. The day before the scheduled meeting, Richard called with an unexpected request. I was wondering if we could meet privately before sitting down with Dr. Lawrence tomorrow, he said. There's something I'd like to discuss with you first. Of course, Evelyn agreed, curious about his request. Would you like to come for dinner this evening? Actually, I was hoping you might come to our house. There's something I want to show you. The invitation to Richard and Melissa's home, a modernist structure in one of Grand Rapids' most exclusive neighborhoods, was surprising. Since the conflict began, their interactions had taken place either at Evelyn's farmhouse or in neutral locations. Never had Richard suggested she come to his territory. I'll be there, Evelyn said. What time would work best? 7? Melissa's taking the kids to Noah's baseball game, so we'll have the house to ourselves. The unusual circumstance, Richard deliberately arranging for Melissa and the children to be absent, piqued Evelyn's curiosity further. What could he possibly want to show her that required such privacy? Richard's home was exactly as Evelyn remembered it, sleek, immaculate, and strangely impersonal despite the family photos artfully arranged on built-in shelving. The furniture looked expensive but uncomfortable, chosen for aesthetic rather than practical considerations. It struck Evelyn, not for the first time, how different this space was from the warm, lived-in home where Richard had grown up. Thanks for coming, Richard said, leading her not to the formal living room where guests were usually received, but to his home office, a space Evelyn had rarely been invited to enter. I've been doing some thinking about our meeting with Dr. Lawrence tomorrow. Oh? Evelyn settled into a leather chair across from Richard's desk, noting the uncharacteristic nervousness in his manner. I've decided to ask him to officially conclude the realignment period early, with a positive assessment regarding my compliance with the trust conditions. Evelyn blinked in surprise. Richard, that's not necessary. We agreed to 6 months, and we're only halfway through. You don't need to, it's not about what I need, he interrupted gently. It's about what I've come to understand. He reached into his desk drawer and removed a folder, not the usual sleek professional portfolio he typically carried, but an older, worn manila folder that Evelyn recognized with a jolt. That's your father's handwriting, she said, noting the familiar script on the folder's tab. Richard nodded. It's Dad's course materials from his ethics and historical context seminar. I found it in a box in the attic when I was looking for Noah's old baseball gear. He opened the folder carefully, revealing yellowed lecture notes and reading lists. I started reading through it, just out of curiosity at first. But then I found this. He extracted a single sheet of paper, a class handout dated from the last year of Thomas's teaching career, just before his diagnosis. The heading read, Ethical Wills, Transmitting Values Across Generations. Dad defined an ethical will as a legacy of values rather than valuables, Richard said, a note of wonder in his voice. He wrote that while traditional wills distribute material possessions, ethical wills pass on the principles, beliefs, and life lessons that constitute a person's true wealth. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. He spoke about this concept often, especially after his diagnosis. He believed it was the most important inheritance any parent could leave their children. The Mort Trust, Richard said quietly. It's his ethical will to me, isn't it? Not just a legal document about money, but a final lesson about what he believed mattered most. Yes, Evelyn whispered. That's exactly what it is. Richard set the paper down carefully. I've spent months feeling resentful about the trust conditions, seeing them as Dad trying to control me from beyond the grave. But reading through his teaching materials, seeing how he approached these ethical questions with his students, I finally understand what he was doing. He looked up, meeting Evelyn's gaze directly. He wasn't trying to force me to be nice to you for money. He was trying to ensure that I didn't lose sight of the values he and you had worked so hard to instill: respect for dignity and autonomy, prioritizing relationships over material gain, seeing the intrinsic worth in people regardless of their utility to me. The insight was so perfectly aligned with Thomas's intentions that Evelyn felt her late husband's presence in the room, as if he were standing just beyond the periphery of vision, nodding in satisfaction. That's why I want to conclude the realignment period early, Richard continued. Not to get it over with or to secure the inheritance sooner, but because I don't want my relationship with you to be overseen by a third party any longer. I don't want Dr. Lawrence evaluating whether I'm being a good son. I want to be a good son because it's who I choose to be, regardless of financial consequences. Evelyn reached across the desk to take her son's hand. Thomas would be so proud of you right now. Not because you've come around to his way of thinking, but because you've thought deeply about what matters and come to your own authentic conclusion. Richard squeezed her hand. I still have concerns about you living alone at the farmhouse as you get older. I probably always will. But I understand now that those concerns need to be expressed with respect for your autonomy and wisdom. And I understand that your concerns come from a place of genuine love, Evelyn acknowledged. I'm not opposed to planning for the future, Richard. I just need to be an active participant in that planning, not a problem to be solved. They talked for over 2 hours, longer and more openly than they had in years. Richard shared his growing discomfort with certain aspects of his career, the pressure to prioritize wealthy clients, the focus on asset accumulation rather than genuine financial well-being. Evelyn spoke about her hopes for the community garden and art studio, her vision of the farmhouse becoming a center for intergenerational connection rather than just her private residence. When it was time for Evelyn to leave, Richard walked her to her car. The early summer evening was mild, fireflies beginning to appear in the manicured landscaping of the upscale neighborhood. I'll see you tomorrow at Dr. Lawrence's office, Richard said. But whatever he decides about the trust, I want you to know that our relationship stands on its own now. The Mort Trust got us here, but it's not what will keep us here. Evelyn embraced her son, feeling the solid strength of him, so like his father's. Thomas always believed you would find your way back to what matters most. He set up the trust. Not because he doubted you would, but to make sure you had a map if you got lost. Richard smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. He was always preparing his students for the journey ahead. I guess he did the same for me, right until the end. As Evelyn drove home through the gathering dusk, she felt Thomas's presence more strongly than she had in years. Not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the living influence of a life well lived, values clearly articulated, love expressed through thoughtful provision for those who would continue after he was gone. The Mort Trust, that final gift named with his scholarly wordplay, had done exactly what he intended. Not through financial leverage, but through the power of making his values explicit, requiring his son to confront the gap between professed beliefs and actual behavior. Richard had called her dead weight on Christmas Eve, seeing her only as a burden to be managed until he could claim his inheritance. Now, just 5 months later, he had rediscovered the values that defined his true inheritance, not money or property, but the ethical foundation his parents had labored to provide. As Evelyn turned onto the long driveway leading to her farmhouse, she saw the community garden in the distance, new green growth now visible in neat rows. Soon the art studio renovations would be complete, bringing drama students and young artists to the converted barn. The farmhouse itself would continue as her home, but it would also become something more, a living legacy, a place where the values she and Thomas had cherished could find new expression through shared projects and intergenerational connections. Not dead weight at all, but vibrant life, continuing to grow, to contribute, to matter. The phrase that had wounded her so deeply at Christmas had become the catalyst for profound transformation, not just in her relationship with Richard, but in her vision for her remaining years. Thomas had always told his students that history's most important lessons were found not in dramatic revolutions but in quiet evolutions of thought and behavior. The Mort Trust, his final teaching tool, had proven his point once again. Through it, he had helped both his wife and son discover that the most valuable inheritance wasn't measured in dollars or acres, but in the courage to live according to one's deepest values, regardless of age or circumstance. As Evelyn parked beside her farmhouse, now softly illuminated in the fading light, she whispered a thank you to the husband whose wisdom continued to guide them. The journey ahead would hold new challenges, no doubt. Aging was not for the faint of heart, but she would face them with renewed purpose and the knowledge that her worth was not diminished by time or circumstance. The weight that mattered wasn't dead at all. It was the weight of lives well lived, of values clearly articulated, of love that continued to teach and transform long after hearts had ceased to beat. That was the true inheritance Thomas had left them both, and through the Mort Trust, he had ensured they would not forget its value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.